Tonight, we begin with a story that's been hidden beneath layers of ice, ash, and academic silence for over 12,000 years. A catastrophe so profound it reshaped an entire continent, yet most people have never heard of it. We're talking about an event that may have wiped out advanced civilizations, triggered a return to Ice Age conditions, and fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development in the Americas. And the strangest part, the evidence has been staring us in the face this entire time. So before we dive into this forgotten chapter of American history, take a moment to settle in, maybe dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey back to a time when the very foundations of our continent were forged in fire and ice. Because what you're about to discover will change how you think about ancient America forever. Around 12,800 years ago, something extraordinary happened to North America. Not gradually, not over centuries, but suddenly, violently, and with such devastating force that it left scars still visible today. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas Impact Event, though most textbooks barely mention it, and many people go their entire lives without learning about this pivotal moment in our continent's history. Picture this. It's a warm evening in what we now call North America, but the landscape is utterly foreign to modern eyes. Massive glaciers still cover much of Canada and the northern United States, but they're retreating, melting away after thousands of years of Ice Age conditions. The climate is warming, and life is flourishing in ways that seem almost mythical today. Giant ground sloths the size of small cars lumber through forests that stretch endlessly across the continent. Herds of mammoth and mastodon thunder across grasslands so vast they dwarf the Great Plains we know today. Saber-toothed cats prowl through woodlands where American cheetahs race across open savannas. And among all this megafauna, humans are thriving too. These aren't the scattered, primitive hunter-gatherers that popular imagination often depicts. These are the Clovis people, sophisticated tool makers whose distinctive spear points have been found from Alaska to Mexico. They've mastered fire, developed complex hunting strategies, and spread across the Americas with remarkable speed. Their tools are works of art, as much as instruments of survival, flaked from stone with such precision that modern knappers struggle to replicate them. But on one particular day, roughly 12,800 years ago, everything changed. The morning probably started like any other. Clovis hunters might have been tracking mammoth herds across the vast grasslands of what would become Texas. Families could have been gathering berries and nuts in the lush forests that covered much of the eastern United States. Children might have been playing along the shores of enormous lakes that no longer exist. Then, without warning, the sky exploded. Current scientific evidence suggests that on this day, Earth encountered something extraordinary. Not a single asteroid or comet, but what researchers now believe was a fragmenting cosmic object, possibly a comet that had broken apart as it approached our planet. Instead of one massive impact, North America was struck by multiple objects simultaneously, like a cosmic shotgun blast that peppered the continent with devastation. The evidence for this event is written in the geological record with stunning clarity, once you know where to look. At archaeological sites across North America, scientists have discovered what they call the black mat, a distinctive dark layer of sediment that appears at exactly the same time period. This isn't just soil that happened to turn dark. It's a layer rich in materials that could only have come from an extraordinary event. Within this black layer, researchers have found concentrations of platinum that are thousands of times higher than normal background levels. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust, but common in asteroids and comets. They've discovered nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals that form only under extreme pressure and temperature conditions, the kind created during cosmic impacts. There are spherules of melted glass, tiny droplets that formed when sand and rock were instantly vaporized and then cooled in mid-air. And perhaps most tellingly, there are massive deposits of charcoal, evidence of continent-wide wildfires that burned simultaneously across thousands of miles. This black mat layer appears at Clovis archaeological sites from coast to coast, at the Gault site in Texas, where some of the most sophisticated Clovis tools ever discovered have been unearthed. The layer marks a clear boundary. Below it, rich deposits of Clovis artifacts and evidence of a thriving culture. Above it, a dramatic change in the archaeological record. At Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, one of the oldest, continuously occupied sites in North America, the same pattern emerges. At dozens of sites across the continent, the story is identical. Life before the black mat, disruption after it. But what would such an event have actually looked like to someone living through it? Imagine you're a Clovis hunter on the Great Plains. The morning is clear. The vast herds of mammoth and bison stretching to the horizon as they have for countless generations. Then, suddenly, the northwestern sky begins to glow. Not the gentle glow of sunrise, but an angry pulsing light that grows brighter by the second. Within minutes, objects become visible, streaking across the sky like burning arrows shot by gods. But these aren't small meteors that flash and disappear. These are massive fragments, some as large as city blocks, trailing fire and leaving smoke plumes that stretch across hundreds of miles of sky. The first impacts would have been visible from hundreds of miles away. Brilliant flashes of light, brighter than the sun, followed by mushroom clouds of debris rising into the atmosphere. The ground would have begun to shake, not the rolling motion of an earthquake, but a deep, continuous rumbling, as impact after impact struck the continent. Animals would have fled in panic, their instincts telling them something was catastrophically wrong. Then would have come the heat. As the impacting objects vaporized forests and grasslands, the thermal pulse would have radiated outward at the speed of light. Hundreds of miles from the impact sites, the intense heat would have instantly ignited everything flammable. Forests that had grown for thousands of years burst into flames simultaneously. Grasslands became infernos. The smoke and ash from these fires would have begun darkening the sky within hours, turning day into an eerie twilight. But the immediate destruction was only the beginning. As debris from the impacts was blasted high into the atmosphere, it began to spread on global wind currents. Within days, the entire northern hemisphere would have been shrouded in a choking haze of dust, ash, and smoke. Temperatures began to plummet as sunlight was blocked. What had been a warming world beginning to emerge from the Ice Age suddenly reversed course, plunging back into conditions so severe that glaciers that had been retreating for thousands of years began advancing again. This climate reversal is known to scientists as the Younger Dryas period, named after an Arctic flower that suddenly reappeared in European pollen records after having been absent for thousands of years. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 12,800 to 11,700 years ago, much of the Northern Hemisphere experienced Ice Age conditions. Temperatures dropped by as much as 27 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. Ice sheets that had been melting reformed and advanced. Sea levels fell as water was locked up in expanding glaciers. The impact on life was devastating. The magnificent megafauna that had dominated North America for millions of years began vanishing with shocking speed. 35 genera of large mammals went extinct in North America during this period. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American cheetahs, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, giant beavers, horses and camels all disappeared from the continent. Some had survived previous climate changes, previous ice ages, previous warming periods. But something about this event was different, more sudden, more severe. The extinction pattern itself tells a story. It wasn't gradual, the slow decline you might expect from climate change alone. It was rapid, almost instantaneous in geological terms. At sites across North America, the fossil record shows abundant megafauna remains below the black mat layer. and virtually none above it. Whatever happened 12,800 years ago was swift and decisive. For the Clovis people, this catastrophe marked the end of their world as they knew it. These skilled hunters had built their entire way of life around the great herds of mammoth and mastodon. Their magnificent spear points, their hunting strategies, their seasonal migrations, all were adapted to a world of abundant megafauna. When that world disappeared virtually overnight, their culture faced an existential crisis. Archaeological evidence shows that Clovis tool-making traditions vanished abruptly at the time of the Black Mat. The distinctive fluted points that had been produced across the continent for centuries simply stop appearing in the archaeological record. What replaced them were smaller, cruder tools, adapted to hunting the smaller animals that survived the extinction. It wasn't just a change in technology, it was evidence of a fundamental disruption in knowledge transmission, the kind that happens when populations are scattered, reduced, and struggling for survival. Recent discoveries have made this picture even more complex and fascinating. At the Galt site in Texas, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that Clovis technology was far more sophisticated than previously believed. They found not just hunting tools, but engraving tools, needles for sewing, and even what appear to be artistic engravings on stone. These weren't simple nomadic hunters. They were people with rich cultural traditions, complex technologies, and possibly even early forms of art and symbolic expression. The Paisley Caves in Oregon have yielded even more intriguing evidence. Here, archaeologists have found human DNA that dates to over 14,000 years ago, well before the Clovis period. This suggests that the story of human occupation in the Americas is far more complex than the simple narrative of Clovis' first migration that dominated archaeology for decades. There may have been multiple waves of human migration, multiple cultures, multiple ways of life that all faced the catastrophe of 12,800 years ago. At Monteverde in Chile, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of human occupation dating back over 14,500 years. The site preserves organic materials with extraordinary fidelity, including wooden tools, medicinal plants, and even pieces of hide and meat. This wasn't a temporary camp, but a settled community with substantial structures, sophisticated toolkits, and detailed knowledge of local resources. The people of Monteverde had mastered their environment in ways that suggest generations of accumulated knowledge and cultural development. All of these sites paint a picture of ancient America that's far richer and more complex than most people imagine. This wasn't an empty continent waiting to be discovered. It was a land of diverse cultures, sophisticated technologies, and deep traditions of knowledge and adaptation. And all of it was disrupted, scattered, and in many cases lost entirely during the catastrophic events of 12,800 years ago. The impact hypothesis helps explain not just the extinction of megafauna, but the apparent gaps in the archaeological record that have puzzled researchers for decades. Why do so many promising cultural traditions seem to vanish abruptly? Why is there so little evidence of continuous development from the earliest human occupations to later periods? The answer may be that much of early American cultural development was literally buried beneath the ash and debris of a cosmic catastrophe. But the story doesn't end with destruction. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, and the survivors of this ancient cataclysm eventually rebuilt, adapted, and flourished. The cultures that emerged from the Younger Dryas period were different from what came before, shaped by the memory of catastrophe and the need to survive in a changed world. They developed new technologies, new ways of organizing society, new relationships with the landscape that reflected the hard-won knowledge that the world could change suddenly and without warning. Modern science is still piecing together the full scope of what happened 12,800 years ago. New techniques for analyzing ancient materials are revealing details that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. Electron microscopy can identify impact materials at the molecular level. Mass spectrometry can detect trace elements that tell the story of cosmic bombardment. Radiocarbon dating has become so precise that scientists can now identify events that happened within decades of each other across vast geographical distances. The precision of these new scientific methods has revealed something remarkable. The cosmic bombardment of 12,800 years ago wasn't limited to North America. Similar evidence has been found across the globe, from Belgium to Syria, from Chile to Antarctica. This suggests that Earth encountered not just a local phenomenon, but something on a planetary scale. The fragments that struck North America were part of a much larger cosmic event that affected the entire world. In recent years, researchers have identified what may be the first confirmed impact crater from this period. Located near Perkins, Louisiana, this circular depression contains all the telltale signs of cosmic impact: shocked quartz crystals that form only under extreme pressure, melted glass spherules created when sand was instantly vaporized, and most importantly, radiocarbon dates that place the formation of this crater at exactly 12,800 years ago, precisely coinciding with the black mat layer found at archaeological sites across the continent. The discovery of this crater has sent ripples through the scientific community. For years, skeptics of the impact hypothesis argued that without a smoking gun, without an actual crater, the evidence was circumstantial. Now that smoking gun may have been found, buried beneath layers of sediment in the Louisiana Bayou country, ground-penetrating radar has revealed the crater's structure, showing the characteristic central uplift and rim deposits that form when massive objects strike the Earth at cosmic velocities. But this Louisiana crater is likely just one of many. Computer models suggest that a fragmenting comet could have created dozens of impact sites across North America. Most would be hidden now, buried under thousands of years of sediment, or erased by erosion and geological processes. The few that survive, like the Louisiana crater, are windows into an event so catastrophic it defies easy comprehension. To understand the true scale of what happened, we need to step back and consider the cosmic context. Throughout Earth's history, our planet has been struck by objects from space. Most are small, burning up harmlessly in the atmosphere as shooting stars. But occasionally, something larger survives the journey through our protective atmospheric envelope. When it does, the results can be world-changing. The most famous example occurred 66 million years ago, when an asteroid roughly 6 miles in diameter struck what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. The impact created the Chicxulub crater, over 100 miles wide, and triggered the mass extinction event that ended the age of dinosaurs. The energy released was equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. Debris was blasted into space, and when it rained back down, the friction heated the atmosphere to oven-like temperatures, cooking everything on the planet's surface. The Younger Dryas impact appears to have been different, but no less devastating. Instead of one massive object, Earth seems to have encountered a swarm of fragments, possibly from a comet that broke apart as it approached our solar system. These fragments struck across a wide area, creating multiple impact sites and triggering continent-wide firestorms. The total energy released may have been comparable to the Chicxulub impact, but spread across many locations rather than concentrated in one. The immediate effects would have been terrifying. Each impact would have created a fireball visible from hundreds of miles away, followed by a shockwave that flattened forests and triggered earthquakes. The heat pulse from the impacts would have ignited everything flammable across vast areas. Within hours, much of North America would have been engulfed in wildfires unlike anything in recorded human history. As the impacts continued, debris was blasted high into the atmosphere. Unlike volcanic ash, which tends to settle relatively quickly, impact debris can remain suspended for months or even years. Fine particles of rock, glass, and soot began circulating in the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering the rapid climate change that characterizes the Younger Dryas period. The speed of this climate shift is what makes it so remarkable. Climate change, as we understand it today, typically happens gradually over decades or centuries. But the transition into the Younger Dryas was almost instantaneous in geological terms, occurring over just a few years. Ice cores from Greenland show that temperatures dropped by as much as 27 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. Ocean currents that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly shifted. Weather patterns that had governed the planet for millennia changed overnight. This rapid climate change created a cascade of environmental disasters. As temperatures plummeted, the great ice sheets that had been retreating since the end of the last ice age suddenly stopped melting and began to advance again. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered much of Canada and the northern United States, reformed and expanded southward. Glaciers that had been mere remnants became continent-spanning rivers of ice once more. The advancing ice had profound effects on the landscape. Rivers that had flowed freely for thousands of years were dammed by glacial ice, creating enormous lakes that periodically burst through their ice barriers in catastrophic floods. The Great Lakes region was repeatedly scoured by these glacial floods, carving the distinctive landscape we see today. What had been temperate forests became Arctic tundra. Grasslands that had supported vast herds of megafauna were buried under snow and ice. For the animals of North America, this environmental upheaval was catastrophic. The extinction pattern that followed the Younger Dryas impact was unlike anything seen in the fossil record. Previous ice ages had come and gone without causing mass extinctions. Animals had adapted, migrated, or found refugia where they could survive harsh conditions. But something about this event was different. The speed of change may have been the key factor. Evolution works over thousands or millions of years, but the Younger Dryas transition happened within decades. Animals that had spent millions of years adapting to particular environments suddenly found those environments gone, replaced by something utterly foreign. Mammoth and mastodon, adapted to cold grasslands, might have survived the climate change alone. But when their food sources were buried under ice and ash, and their migration routes were blocked by advancing glaciers, even these hardy survivors couldn't adapt quickly enough. The giant ground sloths that had dominated South American ecosystems for millions of years faced similar challenges. These massive creatures, some weighing as much as small elephants, had survived previous climate changes by migrating between different habitats. But the Younger Dryas created barriers to migration that hadn't existed before. Mountain passes became blocked by ice. Valleys that had provided corridors between different regions were filled with glacial lakes or buried under ash deposits. Perhaps most tragically, many of these animals were already under pressure from human hunting when the cosmic catastrophe struck. The Clovis people and other early Americans had been hunting megafauna for generations, though probably not at levels that threatened entire species. But when environmental stress was added to hunting pressure, the combination proved lethal. Animals that might have survived either challenge alone couldn't handle both simultaneously. The archaeological evidence for this combined impact is subtle but compelling. Clovis kill sites show clear evidence of human hunting of mammoth, mastodon, and other megafauna right up until the time of the black mat layer. Then, abruptly, the kill sites disappear. Not because humans stopped hunting, but because there was nothing left to hunt. The great herds that had sustained Clovis culture for centuries vanished within a few generations. For the Clovis people themselves, this disappearance of their primary prey animals created an existential crisis. Their entire way of life was built around hunting megafauna. Their sophisticated spear points were designed specifically for bringing down mammoth and mastodon. Their seasonal migration patterns followed the movements of the great herds. Their social organization, their spiritual beliefs, their very identity was tied to the relationship between human hunters and these magnificent animals. When the megafauna disappeared, Clovis culture faced a collapse that went far beyond simple economic hardship. This was a crisis of meaning, a fundamental disruption of the worldview that had sustained them for generations. Archaeological evidence shows that Clovis tool traditions didn't evolve or adapt gradually. They simply stopped. The distinctive fluted points that had been produced with such skill and consistency across the continent are absent from archaeological sites above the black mat layer. What replaced them tells a story of cultural fragmentation and adaptation under extreme stress. The tools that appear in post-Younger Dryas sites are smaller, simpler, and more variable in design. Instead of the standardized perfection of Clovis points, which were so consistent they could have been mass-produced, post-Clovis tools show the kind of improvisation and experimentation that suggests communities struggling to survive in a changed world. This technological regression wasn't necessarily a sign of reduced intelligence or capability. It was evidence of disrupted knowledge transmission. In traditional societies, complex skills like flint knapping are passed down through generations of master craftsmen. The creation of a perfect Clovis point required not just individual skill, but cultural knowledge accumulated over centuries. When communities were scattered and reduced by environmental catastrophe, this accumulated knowledge was lost. The human cost of the Younger Dryas impact may have been even more severe than the archaeological record suggests. Population genetics studies of modern Native Americans show evidence of what researchers call a population bottleneck around the time of the Younger Dryas. This means that the genetic diversity of Native American populations suddenly became much more limited, suggesting that the total population fell dramatically and then slowly recovered from a much smaller group of survivors. This genetic bottleneck coincides perfectly with the timing of the cosmic impact and the subsequent environmental catastrophe. It suggests that human populations in the Americas may have come close to extinction during the Younger Dryas period. The survivors who eventually repopulated the continent were the descendants of scattered groups who managed to find refuge in a few favourable locations and wait out the worst of the climate crisis. Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to reveal where some of these refugia might have been located. In caves throughout the American Southwest, archaeologists have found evidence of continuous human occupation through the Younger Dryas period. These weren't temporary shelters, but long-term settlements where communities survived for generations in underground environments, protected from the harsh surface conditions. The Paisley Caves in Oregon provide particularly compelling evidence of human survival through the Younger Dryas. Here, archaeologists have found not just tools and hearths, but preserved organic materials, including human DNA that spans the entire period of climate crisis. The people who sheltered in these caves weren't just surviving, they were maintaining cultural traditions, developing new technologies, and passing knowledge from generation to generation, even under the most challenging conditions. Similar evidence comes from Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, where the archaeological record shows continuous human occupation for over 16,000 years, including through the entire Younger Dryas period. The tools and artifacts from this site show how human cultures adapted to changing conditions, developing new hunting strategies for smaller game, new plant processing techniques for different food sources, and new social organizations suited to smaller, more mobile groups. These refugee sites paint a picture of human resilience that's both inspiring and sobering. The people who survived the Younger Dryas weren't passive victims of environmental catastrophe. They were active agents of their own survival, making difficult decisions about where to go, what technologies to maintain, and how to organize their societies for maximum resilience. Their descendants would eventually repopulate the continent and develop the rich diversity of Native American cultures that European explorers encountered thousands of years later. But the knowledge and traditions that were lost during the Younger Dryas can never be fully recovered. The sophisticated Clovis technology, the detailed understanding of megafauna behavior, the complex social and spiritual systems that had developed over thousands of years of successful adaptation to North American environments, all of this was disrupted and in many cases lost entirely. The Americas that emerged from the Younger Dryas were fundamentally different from what had existed before, shaped by the memory of catastrophe and the need to survive in a world where stability could never be taken for granted. The global context of the Younger Dryas impact makes the story even more remarkable. Around the same time that Clovis culture was collapsing in North America, similar disruptions were occurring worldwide. In the Middle East, the Natufian culture, which had been developing early agricultural techniques, suddenly abandoned their settlements and returned to nomadic hunting and gathering. In Europe, the Magdalenian culture, known for their sophisticated cave art and tool technology, underwent dramatic changes that mirror what happened to Clovis culture in North America. Perhaps most intriguingly, it was during the aftermath of the Younger Dryas that some of humanity's most remarkable achievements began to emerge. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, often called the world's first temple, was built just as the Younger Dryas period was ending. This massive stone complex, with its intricate carvings and sophisticated astronomical alignments, represents a quantum leap in human cultural and technological development. Some researchers suggest that the trauma of the Younger Dryas may have spurred surviving human populations to develop new forms of social organization and symbolic expression as ways of preserving knowledge and maintaining cultural cohesion in the face of environmental uncertainty. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. As climate conditions began to stabilize at the end of the Younger Dryas, human cultures worldwide began developing new technologies and social innovations. Agriculture, which had been slowly developing in several regions, suddenly accelerated. Complex societies with monumental architecture began appearing in multiple locations simultaneously. Writing systems emerged independently in different parts of the world. It's as if the trauma of near extinction had triggered an explosion of human creativity and innovation. The survivors of the Younger Dryas had learned that the world could change suddenly and catastrophically. They had experienced firsthand how quickly sophisticated cultures could collapse and knowledge could be lost. This awareness may have driven them to develop new ways of preserving and transmitting information, new forms of social organization that could survive environmental catastrophes, and new technologies that could support larger, more stable populations. The development of agriculture in particular may have been partly a response to the Younger Dryas experience. Hunting and gathering had sustained human populations for hundreds of thousands of years. But the Younger Dryas had demonstrated how quickly wild animal and plant populations could disappear. Agriculture offered a way to create more stable and predictable food sources, less vulnerable to environmental catastrophes than hunting megafauna or relying entirely on wild plant foods. The monumental architecture that began appearing at sites like Göbekli Tepe may have served similar purposes. These massive stone complexes weren't just religious centers, they were repositories of knowledge, encoded in their astronomical alignments, their symbolic carvings, and their complex architectural relationships. Building them required the coordination of large groups of people and the preservation of sophisticated technical knowledge across generations. They represented a new form of cultural insurance policy, designed to preserve essential information even if individual communities were scattered or destroyed. The story of the Younger Dryas impact and its aftermath reveals something profound about human nature and human civilization. We are a species that has survived multiple near extinctions, and each time we have emerged stronger, more innovative, and more capable of preserving our cultural achievements. The catastrophe of 12,800 years ago wasn't just a story of destruction and loss. It was also a story of adaptation, survival, and the remarkable human capacity to build something new from the ruins of what came before. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges and contemplate the fragility of our technological civilization, the lessons of the Younger Dryas seem particularly relevant. Our ancestors survived a cosmic catastrophe that would challenge even our modern technological capabilities. They did so through resilience, adaptation, and the preservation of essential knowledge through the darkest of times. Their example reminds us that human civilization, while fragile, also possesses a remarkable capacity for renewal and growth. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, the scientific investigation of the Younger Dryas impact continues to reveal new details about this pivotal moment in human and planetary history. Advanced techniques for analyzing ice cores, sediment cores, and archaeological materials are providing increasingly precise pictures of what happened and when. Genetic studies of both human and animal populations are revealing the scope and pattern of the population bottlenecks that followed the impact. Computer modeling of climate systems is helping scientists understand exactly how the cosmic bombardment triggered such rapid and severe environmental changes. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, gradually revealing the full scope of an event that reshaped not just North America, but the entire trajectory of human civilization on Earth. The story is far from complete, but the outline is becoming increasingly clear. 12,800 years ago, our planet was struck by cosmic forces beyond anything in recorded human history. The immediate effects were catastrophic, but the long-term consequences may have been even more significant, spurring the innovations and cultural developments that led directly to the world we inhabit today. The evidence suggests that this cosmic bombardment may have been far more widespread and devastating than even the initial discoveries indicated. As researchers have expanded their search beyond the original archaeological sites, they've uncovered traces of the impact event in locations that paint a picture of truly continental-scale destruction. In the depths of Greenland's ice sheet, scientists drilling ice cores have found layers of platinum, iridium, and other cosmic materials that date precisely to 12,800 years ago. These aren't just trace amounts. The concentrations are so high, they suggest that debris from the North American impacts was carried by atmospheric currents all the way to the Arctic, where it fell as cosmic snow and became preserved in the ice for millennia. Similar evidence has emerged from lake sediment cores across the Great Lakes region. At dozens of sites from Minnesota to Ontario, the same distinctive layer appears in the geological record. Dark sediments rich in impact materials, microscopic diamonds formed under extreme pressure, and massive deposits of charcoal that speak to fires burning simultaneously across thousands of square miles of forest. The pattern is so consistent, so widespread, that it's becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't a localized event that affected only certain regions. The entire continent appears to have been engulfed in catastrophe simultaneously, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Arctic. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source. Deep beneath the Louisiana Bayou country, ground-penetrating radar has revealed what appears to be a perfectly preserved impact crater. The Perkins crater, as researchers have named it, is roughly 4 miles across and shows all the classic features of a cosmic impact site. There's the characteristic raised rim, where material was blasted outward from the point of impact. There's the central depression, where the impacting object vaporized itself and everything around it. And most remarkably, there are the shocked mineral formations that can only be created by the immense pressures generated when objects traveling at cosmic velocities strike the Earth. Dating of materials from the crater floor confirms what the other evidence already suggested. This impact occurred exactly 12,800 years ago, at precisely the moment when Clovis culture disappeared from the archaeological record, and North America's megafauna began their final march toward extinction. The discovery of this crater has profound implications. It provides the smoking gun that skeptics of the impact hypothesis had long demanded. But more than that, it offers a window into the specific mechanics of the catastrophe. Computer simulations based on the crater's size and structure suggest that the object that created it was roughly the size of a city block, traveling at speeds of perhaps 20 miles per second when it struck. The energy released by such an impact defies easy comprehension. It would have been equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The fireball would have been visible from hundreds of miles away, rising like a second sun above the Louisiana landscape. The shockwave would have flattened forests across multiple states. The debris blasted into the atmosphere would have begun its deadly rain of fire and molten rock within minutes of impact. And this was just one crater from what appears to have been a much larger bombardment. Researchers now believe that the fragmenting comet or asteroid that struck North America may have created dozens of impact sites scattered across the continent. Most are now buried beneath thousands of years of sediment, hidden in lake beds or beneath the fertile soils of the Great Plains. But they're there, waiting to be discovered, each one a testament to the scale of the catastrophe that reshaped ancient America. The Hiawatha crater in Greenland, discovered in recent years, may be another piece of this puzzle. Though its age is still being debated, some evidence suggests it could be contemporary with the North American impacts. If confirmed, it would mean that the cosmic bombardment wasn't limited to the continental United States, but affected the entire North American Arctic as well. To truly understand the impact of this event on ancient American civilization, we need to step back and consider what life was like for the people who lived through it. The Clovis culture wasn't a single tribe or nation, but rather a shared technological tradition that spread across an entire continent. From Alaska to Mexico, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic, people were creating the same distinctive spear points, using the same sophisticated hunting techniques, and following similar patterns of seasonal migration. This widespread cultural unity suggests something remarkable about these ancient Americans. They had developed systems of communication and knowledge transmission that allowed technological innovations to spread across thousands of miles of wilderness. They had established trade networks that moved high-quality stone for tool-making from quarries in specific locations to hunting camps hundreds of miles away. They had created a continental-scale civilization based not on cities or permanent settlements, but on shared knowledge, shared techniques, and shared understanding of how to thrive in the diverse environments of the Americas. The sophistication of Clovis technology becomes more apparent with each new archaeological discovery. At the Gault site in Texas, researchers have uncovered not just the famous fluted spear points, but a complete toolkit that reveals the full range of Clovis capabilities. There are delicate needles for sewing, suggesting they created sophisticated clothing adapted to different climates. There are engraving tools that may have been used for artistic expression or for marking territories and resources. There are specialized scrapers and knives for processing different types of materials, from animal hides to plant fibers. Perhaps most remarkably, some of the stone artifacts from Gault show evidence of heat treatment, a sophisticated technique that involves carefully heating stone to change its properties and make it easier to work. This isn't a simple innovation that someone could discover by accident. It requires detailed knowledge of how different types of stone respond to heat, precise control of temperature, and careful timing of the heating and cooling process. The fact that Clovis toolmakers had mastered this technique suggests a level of technical sophistication that approaches early metallurgy. The artistic capabilities of Clovis people are only beginning to be understood. At several sites, archaeologists have found stones with deliberate engravings, geometric patterns that may represent some of the earliest American art. These aren't crude scratches or random marks. They're carefully planned designs that show clear evidence of symbolic thinking and aesthetic sensibility. Some researchers believe they may represent maps, marking the locations of resources or significant landmarks. Others suggest they could be early forms of written communication, though this remains highly speculative. What's clear is that these were not the simple nomadic hunters that popular imagination has often portrayed. They were people with rich cultural traditions, sophisticated technologies, and complex social organizations that allowed them to coordinate activities across vast distances. They had detailed knowledge of animal behavior, plant resources, seasonal patterns, and geographical features across an entire continent. They were, in every sense, the first true Americans as adapted to this landscape, as any people had ever been to any environment in human history. And then, in what must have seemed like the blink of an eye, their world ended. The morning of the Great Impact may have begun like any other for Clovis communities across North America. Hunting parties would have been tracking mammoth herds across the Great Plains, following migration routes that had been used for generations. Families would have been preparing for seasonal moves, packing their sophisticated toolkits and setting out along well-worn trails towards summer hunting grounds or winter refuges. In what is now the southeastern United States, other groups might have been taking advantage of the rich coastal resources, harvesting shellfish and hunting the diverse wildlife that thrived in the warm, humid climate of the late Pleistocene. The sea levels were lower then, exposing vast areas of what is now the continental shelf, creating rich grasslands and forests that supported enormous populations of animals. Children would have been learning the skills they would need as adults, watching master toolmakers create perfect spear points, listening to elders recite the accumulated wisdom of generations, practicing the complex techniques needed to track and hunt the great animals that dominated their world. Young people would have been forming the bonds and alliances that would guide their adult lives, participating in the intricate social networks that held Clovis society together across thousands of miles of territory. But on this particular morning, something was different. Perhaps the most observant among them noticed unusual lights in the sky, meteors brighter and more persistent than any they had seen before. Maybe the animals began acting strangely, their ancient instincts warning them of danger that human senses couldn't yet detect. Then the sky exploded. The first impacts would have been visible as brilliant flashes of light, brighter than the sun, followed by towering mushroom clouds of debris and vapor. The sound would have been unlike anything in human experience, a continuous thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rolling across the landscape like the voice of angry gods. Those closest to the impact sites would have had no chance of survival. The thermal pulse alone would have been instantly lethal for hundreds of miles around each crater. But even those farther away would have faced unprecedented dangers. As debris from the impacts was blasted high into the atmosphere, it began to rain back down as molten droplets and burning fragments, igniting everything flammable across vast areas of the continent. Within hours, much of North America would have been engulfed in wildfires unlike anything in the historical record. These weren't ordinary forest fires that people could flee or fight. They were firestorms that created their own weather systems, generating hurricane-force winds that spread the flames even faster. Smoke and ash began darkening the sky, turning day into an eerie twilight that would persist for months. The immediate human toll must have been catastrophic. Entire communities would have been wiped out in minutes. The sophisticated social networks that had allowed Clovis culture to flourish across the continent would have been shattered as communication became impossible and survival became the only priority. The knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years of successful adaptation to North American environments began to die with the people who carried it. But the immediate destruction was only the beginning. As impact debris continued to circulate in the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering rapid climate change, the survivors faced an even greater challenge. The world they had known, the world their ancestors had thrived in for millennia, was disappearing before their eyes. Temperatures began dropping almost immediately. What had been temperate forests became Arctic tundra within years. Grasslands that had supported vast herds of mammoth and mastodon were buried under advancing ice sheets. Rivers that had flowed freely for thousands of years became locked in ice for months at a time. The familiar seasonal patterns that had guided human life for generations became unreliable and chaotic. The great animals that had been the foundation of Clovis culture began disappearing with shocking speed. Mammoth and mastodon, already stressed by the sudden climate change, faced additional pressure as their food sources disappeared and their migration routes became blocked by advancing glaciers. The American cheetahs and short-faced bears that had been apex predators for millions of years found their prey populations collapsing. Giant ground sloths that had dominated South American ecosystems since the Miocene epoch struggled to find the plant foods they needed in a world of ice and ash. For the surviving Clovis people, watching these magnificent creatures disappear must have been both heartbreaking and terrifying. These animals weren't just sources of food and materials. They were central to Clovis' spiritual and cultural identity. Their seasonal migrations had provided the rhythm of human life. Their behavior had been the subject of detailed study and accumulated wisdom passed down through countless generations. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of desperate adaptation and cultural collapse. The sophisticated tool traditions that had been maintained with remarkable consistency across the continent for hundreds of years suddenly fragmented and simplified. Instead of the standardized perfection of classic Clovis points, post-impact sites show cruder, more variable tools that suggest communities struggling to maintain basic survival skills under extreme stress. The trade networks that had moved high-quality stone materials across thousands of miles of territory collapsed as communities became isolated and focused on immediate survival. The shared cultural practices that had unified Clovis people from coast to coast began to diverge as different groups adapted to different local conditions and challenges. Perhaps most tragically, the accumulated knowledge that had made Clovis culture so successful began to disappear. In traditional societies, complex skills like sophisticated tool-making are passed down through master-apprentice relationships that require years of training and practice. When master craftsmen died in the initial catastrophe, or when communities became too scattered and stressed to maintain these teaching relationships, centuries of accumulated technical knowledge could be lost within a single generation. The genetic evidence for population bottlenecks during this period suggests that human populations in the Americas may have fallen to critically low levels. Some estimates suggest that the total population of the entire continent may have dropped to fewer than 10,000 individuals, scattered across vast areas and struggling to maintain viable breeding populations. These survivors faced challenges that would test the limits of human adaptability. They had to develop new hunting strategies for smaller, faster prey animals that had survived the extinctions. They had to find new food sources as familiar plants disappeared or became unavailable due to climate change. They had to create new forms of social organization suited to smaller, more mobile groups living in harsh and unpredictable conditions. The caves and rock shelters that provided refuge during this period have become windows into the human experience of surviving an apocalypse. At Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, the archaeological layers from the Younger Dryas period show evidence of people living in the same small space for generations, developing new technologies and maintaining cultural traditions under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The tool assemblages from these refugee sites tell stories of innovation born from desperation. Unable to access the high-quality stone sources they had relied on for centuries, survivors learned to work with whatever materials were locally available. They developed new techniques for processing plant foods that had previously been ignored or considered emergency rations. They created new hunting tools designed for the smaller animals that had survived the extinction event. Perhaps most remarkably, they maintained their humanity through it all. Even in the darkest depths of the climate crisis, people continued to create art, to maintain spiritual practices, to tell stories, and to pass knowledge to the next generation. The human capacity for hope and creativity persisted even when the world itself seemed to be ending. The recovery from the Younger Dryas catastrophe was slow and gradual. As climate conditions began to stabilize around 11,700 years ago, the survivors and their descendants began to emerge from their refuges and repopulate the continent. But the world they inherited was fundamentally different from the one their ancestors had known. The megafauna that had dominated North American ecosystems for millions of years were gone forever. The familiar seasonal patterns and environmental cues that had guided human life for millennia had been replaced by new and often unpredictable conditions. The sophisticated cultural traditions and technological knowledge that had allowed Clovis people to thrive across the continent had been disrupted and in many cases lost entirely. The cultures that emerged from this crucible were necessarily different from what had come before. They were more diverse, more localized, more focused on specific regional adaptations rather than continent-wide unity. They developed new technologies suited to hunting smaller game and processing different types of plant foods. They created new social organizations that could survive in a world where stability could never be taken for granted. But they also carried forward something precious from the pre-impact world, the fundamental human qualities that had allowed their ancestors to survive the catastrophe, resilience, adaptability, creativity, and the determination to build something better from the ruins of what had been lost. These became the foundation for all the remarkable cultures that would follow. In the centuries after the Younger Dryas, the descendants of the impact survivors would go on to develop some of the most sophisticated and diverse cultures in human history. They would build great cities like Cahokia, create complex agricultural systems that supported millions of people, develop art and architecture that rivals anything produced anywhere in the world, and maintain oral traditions that preserved essential knowledge across thousands of years. The trauma of the Great Catastrophe may have actually contributed to these achievements. Communities that had experienced firsthand how quickly sophisticated cultures could collapse developed new ways of preserving and transmitting knowledge. They created redundant systems for maintaining essential skills and information. They developed social institutions designed to survive environmental and social upheavals. The monumental architecture that began appearing in various parts of the world shortly after the end of the Younger Dryas may have served similar purposes. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with their complex astronomical alignments and symbolic carvings, weren't just religious centers. They were repositories of knowledge, designed to preserve essential information about seasonal cycles, celestial patterns, and other crucial knowledge, even if the communities that created them were scattered or destroyed. The development of agriculture, too, may have been partly a response to the Younger Dryas experience. Hunting and gathering had sustained human populations successfully for hundreds of thousands of years, but the catastrophe had demonstrated how quickly wild animal and plant populations could disappear. Agriculture offered a way to create more stable and predictable food sources, less vulnerable to sudden environmental changes than reliance on wild resources. The precision and sophistication of early agricultural systems suggests they weren't developed by people who were simply tired of hunting and gathering. They were created by people who understood intimately how fragile the relationship between humans and their environment could be. The complex irrigation systems, the careful selection and breeding of crops, the development of storage techniques that could preserve food through years of scarcity, all of these innovations reflect hard-won knowledge about the need to prepare for unpredictable disasters. The story of human survival and recovery from the Younger Dryas impact reveals something profound about our species. We are remarkably adaptable, capable of surviving catastrophes that would eliminate most other large mammals. But more than that, we have the ability to learn from catastrophe, to use the experience of near extinction as a foundation for building something better and more resilient than what existed before. The cultures that emerged from the Younger Dryas weren't just different from what had come before. In many ways, they were better adapted to the realities of life on a planet where sudden, catastrophic change is always a possibility. They developed technologies and social institutions that could survive disruption. They created knowledge preservation systems that could maintain essential information across generations even under the most challenging conditions. These innovations didn't emerge immediately. The recovery from the Younger Dryas took thousands of years, and it was often marked by setbacks and failures. But the overall trajectory was clear. The survivors and their descendants were building something new, something that incorporated the lessons learned from living through an apocalypse. The archaeological record from the post-Younger Dryas period shows increasing sophistication in technology, art, and social organization. Tools become more specialized and efficient. Art becomes more complex and symbolic. Settlement patterns show evidence of larger, more stable communities. Trade networks begin to re-establish themselves, eventually becoming more extensive than anything that had existed in the pre-impact world. Perhaps most remarkably, the oral traditions of many Native American cultures contain what appear to be memories of the Great Catastrophe. Stories of stars falling from the sky, of great fires that burned across the world, of a time when the animals disappeared and the world became cold and dark. These stories, passed down through more than 400 generations, may be the longest maintained historical records in human existence. The precision of some of these oral traditions is startling. Some describe astronomical events that match what scientists now know about the cosmic bombardment. Others describe environmental changes that correspond exactly to what the geological record shows happened during the Younger Dryas period. A few even seem to preserve knowledge about specific impact sites or the sequence of events during the catastrophe itself. These oral traditions represent something unprecedented in human history: the preservation of detailed historical information across more than 12,000 years without any form of writing. They suggest that the impact of the Younger Dryas catastrophe was so profound, so transformative, that the memory of it became embedded in the very foundation of human culture in the Americas. The implications of this are staggering. If oral traditions can preserve accurate information for 12,000 years, what other knowledge might be encoded in the stories, songs, and ceremonies of indigenous cultures around the world? How much of what we consider mythology might actually be historical memory, distorted by time, but retaining essential truths about humanity's deep past? Modern scientific investigation of the Younger Dryas impact is revealing not just the physical evidence of what happened, but also the remarkable human story of survival, adaptation, and recovery. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, gradually revealing the full scope of an event that was truly transformative for both human civilization and the North American continent. The precision of modern analytical techniques continues to surprise researchers. Mass spectrometry can now identify individual molecules that were created during the impact event. Electron microscopy can reveal the structure of shocked minerals at the atomic level. Radiocarbon dating has become so accurate that scientists can identify events that happened within decades of each other across vast geographical distances. These techniques are revealing details about the impact that would have been impossible to detect even a few years ago. The specific chemistry of the impact materials is providing clues about the composition and origin of the cosmic objects that struck North America. The distribution patterns of debris are revealing the number, size, and locations of individual impact sites. The precise timing of different events is showing how the catastrophe unfolded over days, weeks, and months. Perhaps most importantly, these investigations are revealing the full scope of human resilience and adaptability. The people who survived the Younger Dryas impact weren't just lucky, they were resourceful, innovative, and determined. They made conscious decisions about how to adapt to radically changed conditions. They developed new technologies and social institutions specifically designed to survive in an uncertain world. They preserved and transmitted essential knowledge even under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Their story is not just ancient history. In an era when humanity faces its own environmental challenges and contemplates the fragility of our technological civilization, the example of the Younger Dryas survivors offers both sobering warnings and hopeful possibilities. It reminds us that human civilization, while fragile, also possesses a remarkable capacity for renewal and adaptation, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The continental-scale catastrophe that struck North America 12,800 years ago was unprecedented in human experience. But the human response to that catastrophe, the determination to survive, adapt, and build something better from the ruins of what had been lost, represents something equally unprecedented. It shows us that even in the darkest of times, even when the world itself seems to be ending, the human spirit can endure, innovate, and ultimately triumph. The discovery and investigation of the Younger Dryas impact is still in its early stages. Each new archaeological site, each new ice core sample, each new application of advanced analytical techniques reveals additional details about this pivotal moment in human and planetary history. The full story of what happened during those crucial centuries is still being written, one scientific discovery at a time. But already, enough is known to recognize that the Younger Dryas impact was one of the most significant events in the history of the Americas. It ended one chapter of human development and began another. It reshaped the continent's ecosystems and climate. It challenged human adaptability to its very limits and sparked innovations that would influence the development of civilization for thousands of years to come. The great catastrophe that changed America forever wasn't just a geological event or even just an ecological disaster. It was a fundamental transformation in the human story, a moment when our species faced extinction and chose instead to adapt, survive, and ultimately thrive. The descendants of those who lived through that transformation went on to build some of the most remarkable civilizations in human history, always carrying with them the hard-won knowledge that the world can change suddenly and completely, and that human survival depends not just on technological sophistication, but on resilience, adaptability, and the determination to preserve what matters most through even the darkest of times. As we continue to uncover the evidence and piece together the full story of this ancient cataclysm, we're not just learning about the past. We're discovering fundamental truths about human nature, about our relationship with the natural world, and about our capacity to survive and thrive even in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The great catastrophe of 12,800 years ago may have ended one world, but it also began another, and that beginning continues to shape the Americas we know today. The story becomes even more remarkable when we examine what happened beyond North America's borders during this same period. While the continent was being reshaped by cosmic fire and ice, similar disruptions were occurring across the globe, suggesting that the Younger Dryas event wasn't just a regional catastrophe, but a planetary transformation. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, something extraordinary was taking place. As the Younger Dryas period was ending, around 11,600 years ago, people were constructing what would become known as Göbekli Tepe, often called the world's first temple. This massive stone complex, with its intricately carved pillars and sophisticated astronomical alignments, represents a quantum leap in human cultural and technological development. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. Just as climate conditions began stabilizing after more than 1,000 years of harsh Younger Dryas conditions, human cultures worldwide began developing new technologies and social innovations at an unprecedented pace. It's as if the trauma of near extinction had triggered an explosion of human creativity and problem-solving. The builders of Göbekli Tepe weren't simple hunter-gatherers scratching out a basic existence. They were people with sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and artistic expression. The massive stone pillars, some weighing as much as 20 tons, were quarried from limestone bedrock, transported across rough terrain, and erected with precision that would challenge modern construction crews. But perhaps most significantly, these monuments weren't built by settled agricultural communities. Archaeological evidence shows that the people who created Göbekli Tepe were still primarily hunters and gatherers, yet they were capable of organizing and executing construction projects that required the coordination of hundreds of workers over many years. This suggests new forms of social organization, new ways of preserving and transmitting knowledge, and new motivations for creating permanent structures. Some researchers believe that sites like Göbekli Tepe served as more than religious centers. They may have been repositories of knowledge designed to preserve essential information about seasonal cycles, astronomical patterns, and other crucial understanding, even if the communities that created them faced future disasters. The complex symbolic carvings found throughout the site might represent an early form of information storage, a way of encoding important knowledge in stone that could survive even if human memory failed. This response to the trauma of the Younger Dryas wasn't limited to Turkey. Across the Middle East, communities that had been developing early agricultural techniques before the climate crisis suddenly accelerated their innovations as conditions improved. The Natufian culture, which had abandoned settled life during the worst of the Younger Dryas, returned to their villages and began experimenting with new forms of plant cultivation and animal domestication. In the Fertile Crescent, the development of true agriculture exploded in the centuries following the end of the Younger Dryas. Wheat, barley, lentils, and peas were all domesticated within a relatively short period, creating the foundation for the world's first agricultural civilizations. This wasn't gradual experimentation spread across millennia. It was rapid, focused innovation that suggests people were actively seeking more stable and predictable food sources after experiencing the fragility of hunting and gathering during environmental catastrophe. The pattern repeats across multiple continents. In China, rice cultivation began developing shortly after the end of the Younger Dryas. In the Americas, the domestication of maize, beans, and squash accelerated in the post-Younger Dryas period. In each case, agricultural development seems to have been spurred by the memory of environmental instability and the need for more reliable food sources. But the most remarkable response to the Younger Dryas may have been the development of new methods for preserving and transmitting knowledge. Across multiple cultures, we see the emergence of complex oral traditions, sophisticated artistic expressions, and eventually writing systems, all seeming to serve the same basic function, ensuring that essential information could survive even if individual communities were scattered or destroyed. The development of writing itself may have been partly motivated by the need to preserve knowledge against future catastrophes. The earliest writing systems weren't primarily used for literature or record-keeping in the modern sense. They were focused on preserving practical information, astronomical observations, agricultural techniques, genealogies, and legal codes. All the kinds of knowledge that would be essential for rebuilding civilization if it were ever disrupted again. In North America, the recovery from the Younger Dryas followed similar patterns but with unique characteristics shaped by the specific conditions the survivors faced. The descendants of the Clovis people and other pre-impact cultures gradually repopulated the continent, but they did so in a world fundamentally different from what their ancestors had known. The great herds of megafauna were gone forever, replaced by smaller, more diverse animal populations. The climate had stabilized, but remained more variable and unpredictable than the relatively stable conditions of the late Pleistocene. The sophisticated continent-wide cultural unity that had characterized Clovis society had been shattered, replaced by more localized, regionally adapted cultures. Yet from this fragmentation came remarkable diversity and innovation. As different groups adapted to different regional conditions, they developed specialized technologies and cultural practices suited to their specific environments. Arctic peoples developed sophisticated tools and techniques for surviving in extremely cold conditions. Desert peoples created water management systems and plant processing technologies that allowed them to thrive in arid regions. Forest peoples developed complex ecological knowledge that enabled them to manage entire landscapes through controlled burning and selective harvesting. The archaeological record from the millennia following the Younger Dryas shows increasing sophistication in technology, art, and social organization across the Americas. Tools become more specialized and efficient. Artistic traditions develop that rival anything produced anywhere in the world. Settlement patterns show evidence of larger, more stable communities with complex internal organization. Perhaps most remarkably, trade networks began to re-establish themselves on an even grander scale than had existed before the catastrophe. Obsidian from volcanic sources in the Western Mountains has been found in archaeological sites on the Atlantic coast. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico appear in sites throughout the interior of the continent. Copper from the Great Lakes region was worked into tools and ornaments found thousands of miles away. These trade networks weren't just about exchanging materials. They were systems for sharing knowledge, spreading innovations, and maintaining cultural connections across vast distances. They suggest that the descendants of the Younger Dryas survivors had learned from their ancestors' experience of cultural isolation and were actively working to prevent such fragmentation from happening again. The development of monumental architecture in the Americas also accelerated in the post-Younger Dryas period. Sites like Poverty Point in Louisiana, with its massive earthen mounds and complex geometric layout, were constructed by people who had never developed writing or metal tools, yet they demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and social organization. Watson Brake, also in Louisiana, may be even older, with some earthworks dating to nearly 6,000 years ago. These massive constructions required the coordination of thousands of workers and the preservation of complex technical knowledge across generations. Like Göbekli Tepe, they represent new forms of cultural insurance designed to preserve essential information and maintain social cohesion even in the face of environmental or social upheavals. The oral traditions that developed in post-Younger Dryas America serve similar functions. Native American cultures across the continent developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge through spoken word, song, and ceremony. These weren't simple stories or entertainment. They were complex information storage systems that could maintain detailed knowledge about everything from astronomical cycles to medicinal plants to historical events across hundreds of generations. The precision of some of these oral traditions continues to amaze researchers. Stories that describe specific geographical features, seasonal patterns, or historical events have been verified through archaeological and geological evidence. In some cases, oral traditions have led scientists to new discoveries, providing clues about the locations of archaeological sites or the timing of past environmental changes. The Menominee people of the Great Lakes region maintain oral traditions that describe the formation of the lakes themselves, including details about glacial processes that match what geologists have determined through scientific study. The Ojibwe have stories about the retreat of the ice sheets that include information about specific landforms and the timing of environmental changes that correspond closely to the geological record. Perhaps most remarkably, many Native American oral traditions contain what appear to be memories of the Younger Dryas catastrophe itself. Stories of stars falling from the sky, of great fires that burned across the world, of a time when the animals disappeared and the world became cold and dark. These stories, passed down through more than 400 generations, may represent the longest maintained historical records in human existence. The Cherokee tell of a time when the world caught fire and almost everything burned, followed by a long period of cold and darkness. The Lakota describe a time when burning stones fell from the sky and the buffalo disappeared. The Hopi speak of the destruction of previous worlds by fire and ice, followed by the emergence of new ways of life adapted to changed conditions. Some of these traditions include details that seem to describe specific aspects of the cosmic bombardment. Stories of multiple objects falling simultaneously from the sky match what scientists now believe happened during the fragmented comet impact. Descriptions of the sequence of events, the immediate fires followed by long-term climate change, correspond to what the geological record shows occurred during the Younger Dryas period. The fact that these memories have been preserved with such fidelity for over 12,000 years speaks to something profound about the impact of the Younger Dryas catastrophe. It wasn't just another environmental challenge that human societies adapted to and moved on from. It was a transformative event so significant that it became embedded in the very foundation of human culture in the Americas. This preservation of catastrophic memory may have served important survival functions. Communities that maintained detailed knowledge about past disasters would be better prepared to recognize and respond to future threats. Stories about environmental instability and sudden change would encourage the development of more resilient technologies and social institutions. The memory of near extinction would motivate efforts to preserve essential knowledge and maintain cultural continuity. Modern scientific investigation continues to reveal new evidence about the Younger Dryas impact and its consequences. Each new discovery adds depth and complexity to our understanding of this pivotal moment in human and planetary history. Advanced analytical techniques are revealing details that would have been impossible to detect even a few decades ago. Recent work with ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica has provided increasingly precise information about the timing and global extent of the climate changes associated with the Younger Dryas. These ice cores preserve annual layers of snowfall going back over 100,000 years, creating a detailed record of past climate conditions with year-by-year resolution. The ice core data shows that the transition into the Younger Dryas was remarkably abrupt. In some locations, average temperatures dropped by as much as 27 degrees Fahrenheit within a single decade. Ocean currents that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly shifted. Precipitation patterns that had governed regional climates for millennia changed overnight in geological terms. This rapid climate change created cascading effects throughout Earth's environmental systems. As temperatures plummeted, the great ice sheets that had been retreating since the end of the last ice age suddenly stopped melting and began to advance again. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered much of Canada and the northern United States, reformed and expanded southward. Glaciers that had been mere remnants became continent-spanning rivers of ice once more. The advancing ice had profound effects on hydrology and landscape formation. Rivers that had flowed freely for thousands of years were dammed by glacial ice, creating enormous lakes that periodically burst through their barriers in catastrophic floods. Lake Missoula, formed when glacial ice blocked the Clark Fork River in what is now western Montana, contained as much water as half of Lake Michigan. When the ice dam failed, the entire volume was released in a matter of days, creating floods of unprecedented scale. These Missoula floods carved the distinctive landscape of the Columbia River Gorge and the channeled scablands of eastern Washington. The flood waters, moving at speeds of up to 60 miles per hour and reaching depths of 400 feet, stripped away hundreds of feet of soil and rock, creating features that seem impossible to modern observers. Giant ripple marks the height of 3-story buildings, scattered boulders the size of houses, and deep channels carved through solid basalt all testify to the incredible power of these glacial outburst floods. Similar processes were occurring throughout the regions affected by advancing ice sheets. The Great Lakes themselves were repeatedly scoured and reformed by glacial action during this period. The distinctive landscapes of New England, with their countless lakes, rocky hills, and scattered boulders, were created by the advance and retreat of ice sheets during the Younger Dryas and subsequent climate fluctuations. For the plants and animals of North America, this environmental upheaval was catastrophic. The extinction pattern that followed the Younger Dryas impact was unlike anything seen in the fossil record. Previous ice ages had come and gone without causing mass extinctions. Animals had adapted, migrated, or found refugia where they could survive harsh conditions. But something about this event was different. The speed of change may have been the crucial factor. Evolution and adaptation work over thousands or millions of years, but the Younger Dryas transition happened within decades. Animals that had spent millions of years adapting to particular environments suddenly found those environments gone, replaced by something utterly foreign. The familiar migration routes, seasonal patterns, and food sources that had sustained them for millennia disappeared virtually overnight. Mammoth populations, which had survived previous ice ages and climate changes, faced conditions they couldn't adapt to quickly enough, as grasslands were replaced by forests or buried under ice. And as climate became more variable and unpredictable, even these hardy survivors couldn't maintain viable populations. The last mammoths on the North American mainland disappeared during the Younger Dryas period, though small populations survived on isolated islands for several more millennia. The giant ground sloths that had dominated South American ecosystems for over 30 million years faced similar challenges. These massive creatures, some weighing as much as small elephants, had survived the rise and fall of mountain ranges, the opening and closing of ocean basins, and countless climate fluctuations. But the rapid environmental changes of the Younger Dryas proved insurmountable. The last giant ground sloths disappeared from most of South America during this period, persisting only in a few isolated locations, before finally going extinct several thousand years later. The pattern repeats across dozens of species. American cheetahs, short-faced bears, giant beavers, horses, and camels all vanished from North America during or immediately after the Younger Dryas period. In each case, these were animals that had survived previous environmental challenges, previous climate changes, previous ice ages. The Younger Dryas was different in ways that made survival impossible, even for the most adaptable species. Recent genetic studies have begun to reveal the mechanisms behind these extinctions. Analysis of DNA from fossils and museum specimens shows that many megafauna populations experienced severe genetic bottlenecks during the Younger Dryas period. This means that even before the final extinctions, populations had become so small and isolated that they lost much of their genetic diversity. This loss of diversity made them more vulnerable to disease, environmental stress, and inbreeding, creating a downward spiral that led inevitably to extinction. The human populations of the Americas faced similar challenges, though their greater behavioral flexibility allowed some groups to survive where the megafauna could not. Genetic studies of modern Native American populations show clear evidence of population bottlenecks during the Younger Dryas period, suggesting that human numbers also fell to critically low levels. The survivors of this population crash were scattered across the continent in small, isolated groups. Archaeological evidence suggests that some found refuge in caves and rock shelters, while others adapted to life in marginal environments that had been less affected by the climate changes. These refuge populations maintained the genetic and cultural diversity necessary for eventual recovery, but the process was slow and difficult. At Paisley Cave in Oregon, archaeologists have found evidence of continuous human occupation through the entire Younger Dryas period. The cave provided protection from the harsh surface conditions, and the people who lived there developed new technologies and survival strategies suited to their changed circumstances. They learned to exploit resources that previous generations had ignored, developed new hunting techniques for smaller prey animals, and created new tool technologies adapted to available materials. Similar evidence comes from caves throughout the American West and Southeast. At Dust Cave in Alabama, archaeologists have uncovered a continuous record of human occupation spanning over 10,000 years, including through the Younger Dryas period. The artifacts from these sites show how human cultures adapted to radically changed conditions, developing new technologies and social organizations suited to survival in an unstable world. The tools found in these refuge sites tell stories of innovation under extreme pressure. Unable to access the high-quality stone sources they had relied on for generations, survivors learned to work with whatever materials were locally available. They developed new techniques for processing plant foods that had previously been considered emergency rations. They created new hunting weapons designed for the smaller, faster animals that had survived the extinction event. Perhaps most remarkably, they maintained their humanity through it all. Even in the most challenging conditions, people continued to create art, maintain spiritual practices, tell stories, and pass knowledge to the next generation. Caves that served as refuges during the Younger Dryas contain not just survival tools, but also artistic expressions, ceremonial objects, and evidence of complex social relationships. The recovery from the Younger Dryas catastrophe was gradual and uneven. As climate conditions began to stabilize around 11,700 years ago, human populations slowly began to expand from their refuges and recolonize areas that had been abandoned during the worst of the climate crisis. But the world they inherited was fundamentally different from the one their ancestors had known. The process of recolonization created new patterns of cultural diversity. A small group spread into different regions and adapted to different local conditions. They developed distinct cultural traditions, technologies, and social organizations. The continent-wide cultural unity that had characterized pre-impact societies like the Clovis culture was replaced by a mosaic of regionally adapted cultures, each suited to specific environmental conditions and challenges. This cultural diversification accelerated as populations grew and came into contact with one another. Trade networks began to re-establish themselves, but instead of simply moving materials from one place to another, they became conduits for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Innovations developed in one region could spread rapidly to others, but they were often modified and adapted to local conditions in the process. The result was an explosion of cultural and technological innovation that continued for thousands of years. New hunting techniques, new plant processing technologies, new forms of social organization, and new artistic traditions emerged across the Americas. The diversity of Native American cultures that European explorers would encounter thousands of years later had its roots in this post-Younger Dryas period of adaptation and innovation. The development of agriculture in the Americas provides a clear example of this process. Unlike in other parts of the world, where agriculture developed relatively quickly in a few key locations and then spread to surrounding areas, American agriculture emerged independently in multiple regions and involved the domestication of many different plant species. In the eastern United States, people began domesticating sunflowers, squash, and various seed plants during the early post-Younger Dryas period. In Mexico, the domestication of maize began around 9,000 years ago and continued for thousands of years as people gradually transformed a wild grass called teosinte into the corn we know today. In the Andes, people domesticated potatoes, quinoa, and dozens of other crops adapted to high-altitude conditions. Each of these agricultural developments represented not just technological innovation, but also profound changes in social organization, settlement patterns, and relationships with the landscape. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming required new forms of cooperation, new ways of organizing labor, and new institutions for storing and distributing food. It also required new knowledge systems for understanding plant biology, soil management, and seasonal cycles. The sophistication of American agricultural systems becomes apparent when we examine sites like Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak, around 1,000 years ago, Cahokia was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people. The agricultural system that supported this urban center was remarkably complex, involving the cultivation of multiple crops, sophisticated soil management techniques, and extensive trade networks that brought food from hundreds of miles away. The monumental architecture at Cahokia rivaled anything being built anywhere in the world at that time. Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in North America, contains over 22 million cubic feet of earth and rises 100 feet above the surrounding landscape. The precision of its construction and its alignment with astronomical phenomena demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and mathematics. Similar developments were occurring throughout the Americas during the post-Younger Dryas period. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest created complex irrigation systems and built elaborate cliff dwellings that housed thousands of people. The mound-building cultures of the eastern United States constructed earthworks that stretched for miles and required the coordination of thousands of workers. The civilizations of Mesoamerica developed writing systems, mathematical concepts, and astronomical knowledge that rivaled anything being produced in the Old World. All of these achievements had their ultimate roots in the innovations and adaptations that emerged from the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The trauma of near extinction had forced human populations to develop new technologies, new social institutions, and new ways of thinking about their relationship with the environment. The cultures that emerged from this crucible were more diverse, more innovative, and in many ways more resilient than what had existed before. The preservation of knowledge about the Younger Dryas catastrophe in Native American oral traditions serves as a reminder of how profoundly this event shaped human consciousness in the Americas. These weren't just stories about the distant past. They were warnings about the fragility of human civilization and the need to be prepared for sudden environmental changes. They encouraged the development of technologies and social institutions that could survive disruption, and they motivated efforts to preserve essential knowledge across generations. Modern scientific investigation of the Younger Dryas impact continues to reveal new details about this pivotal moment in human and planetary history. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how cosmic events can reshape entire continents and redirect the course of human civilization. But perhaps more importantly, this research is revealing fundamental truths about human resilience and adaptability. The people who survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe weren't just lucky. They were resourceful, innovative, and determined. They made conscious decisions about how to adapt to radically changed conditions. They developed new technologies and social institutions specifically designed to survive in an uncertain world. They preserved and transmitted essential knowledge even under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Their example is particularly relevant today as we face our own environmental challenges and contemplate the fragility of our technological civilization. The Younger Dryas survivors remind us that human societies can survive and even thrive in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. But they also remind us that such survival requires preparation, adaptation, and the wisdom to learn from past disasters. The story of the ancient cataclysm that changed America forever is still being written. Each new archaeological discovery, each new ice core sample, each new application of advanced analytical techniques reveals additional details about this remarkable period in human and planetary history. The full scope of what happened during the Younger Dryas period may never be completely understood, but enough is already known to recognize its profound significance. This wasn't just another chapter in the long story of human adaptation to environmental change. It was a fundamental transformation that reshaped the Americas and influenced the development of human civilization for thousands of years. The catastrophe that struck 12,800 years ago ended one world and began another, and the reverberations of that transformation continue to shape the Americas we know today. The scientific evidence for the Younger Dryas impact continues to accumulate from multiple sources and research disciplines. Geologists studying sediment cores from lakes across North America have found the distinctive black layer containing impact materials at site after site. Archaeologists excavating Paleo-Indian sites have documented the abrupt disappearance of Clovis culture and the dramatic changes that followed. Climate scientists analyzing ice cores have traced the rapid environmental changes that characterize the Younger Dryas period. Each line of evidence supports the same basic conclusion. Something extraordinary happened to North America 12,800 years ago. Something that fundamentally altered the trajectory of both human and natural history on the continent. The cosmic bombardment hypothesis provides the most coherent explanation for all the available evidence, though scientists continue to debate specific details about the number, size, and exact locations of the impacts. Recent advances in analytical chemistry have made it possible to identify impact materials with unprecedented precision. Mass spectrometry can detect trace elements that are rare in Earth's crust, but common in asteroids and comets. Electron microscopy can reveal the characteristic structures of shocked minerals that form only under the extreme pressures generated by cosmic impacts. These techniques are confirming the presence of impact materials at dozens of sites across North America and revealing new details about the nature and scale of the bombardment. Perhaps most significantly, these investigations are revealing that the Younger Dryas impact wasn't an isolated event in Earth's history. Similar cosmic bombardments appear to have occurred at other times, suggesting that our planet periodically encounters swarms of cosmic debris that can trigger global environmental changes. The Younger Dryas event may have been part of a larger pattern of cosmic impacts that have shaped Earth's history and influenced the evolution of life on our planet. The implications of this research extend far beyond academic interest in ancient history. Understanding how cosmic impacts can trigger rapid climate change and environmental disruption is crucial for assessing the risks our own civilization faces from similar events in the future. The Younger Dryas impact demonstrates that even relatively small cosmic objects can have global consequences if they strike at the right time and place. Modern space agencies are increasingly focused on identifying and tracking potentially hazardous asteroids and comets that could threaten Earth in the future. The Younger Dryas research provides important insights into how such impacts might affect global climate, ecosystems, and human societies. It also offers lessons about how human communities can prepare for and respond to sudden environmental catastrophes. The story of human survival and recovery from the Younger Dryas impact offers both warnings and hope for our own future. It demonstrates that human civilization is more fragile than we often assume, vulnerable to sudden disruption by forces beyond our control. But it also shows that human beings possess remarkable capacities for adaptation, innovation, and recovery, even in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The technologies and social institutions that emerged from the Younger Dryas catastrophe were specifically designed to survive in an uncertain world. They emphasized flexibility over efficiency, resilience over optimization, and the preservation of essential knowledge over the accumulation of specialized expertise. These principles may be just as relevant for building sustainable civilizations today as they were for the survivors of the ancient catastrophe. The oral traditions that preserved knowledge of the Younger Dryas, impact for over 12,000 years, demonstrate the power of cultural memory to maintain essential information across vast periods of time. In our own era of rapid technological change and information overload, these ancient knowledge preservation systems offer valuable lessons about how to maintain continuity of important information across generations. The diversity of cultures that emerged from the post-Younger Dryas recovery period shows how catastrophe can sometimes stimulate rather than suppress human creativity and innovation. The breakdown of existing systems and the need to adapt to radically changed conditions created opportunities for experimentation with new technologies, new social organizations, and new ways of understanding the world. The emergence from this ancient crucible wasn't uniform across the continent. Different regions faced different challenges, and the solutions that developed were as varied as the landscapes themselves. In the Arctic, where the climate changes were most severe, human populations developed technologies that seem almost impossibly sophisticated for their time. Bone needles so fine they rival modern surgical instruments. Tailored clothing systems with multiple layers designed for maximum insulation. Hunting tools specifically adapted for life on the sea ice that formed as temperatures plummeted. These weren't desperate improvisations. They were carefully engineered solutions to specific environmental challenges, developed through generations of accumulated knowledge and passed down through oral traditions that emphasized precision and reliability. Every stitch in an Arctic parka, every curve of a harpoon point, represented life or death decisions made by people who understood intimately that survival depended on getting the details exactly right. In the Great Basin, where lakes that had existed for thousands of years suddenly dried up or froze solid, different innovations emerged. People learned to process previously ignored plant foods, developing grinding stones and basketry techniques that could extract nutrition from seeds and roots that earlier generations had considered inedible. They created portable shelters that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as groups moved between scattered water sources in an increasingly arid landscape. The sophistication of these technologies becomes apparent when modern researchers attempt to replicate them. Archaeologists have spent years trying to understand how Great Basin peoples created baskets so tightly woven they could hold water without leaking, using only plant fibers and stone tools. The knowledge required wasn't just technical, but ecological, involving detailed understanding of when different plants should be harvested, how they should be processed, and how the finished materials would behave under different conditions. Along the changing coastlines, where sea levels fluctuated wildly as ice sheets advanced and retreated, maritime cultures developed that were equally sophisticated. They created boats capable of handling rough seas and long-distance travel, navigation systems based on stars, currents, and wildlife behavior, and fishing technologies adapted to species that were themselves adapting to changing ocean conditions. The Ertugrul culture of northern Europe provides a parallel example of how coastal peoples adapted to post-catastrophe conditions. Their shell middens, massive deposits of discarded oyster and mussel shells, tell stories of communities that thrived along changing shorelines by developing detailed knowledge of marine ecosystems and seasonal patterns. Similar adaptations were occurring along American coasts, though much of the evidence now lies beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water on the continental shelf. These regional adaptations weren't isolated developments. Trade networks that had collapsed during the worst of the Younger Dryas began to re-establish themselves, but in new forms adapted to the changed landscape. Instead of the continent-spanning uniformity that had characterized Clovis culture, post-catastrophe trade involved the exchange of specialized technologies and materials between groups adapted to different environments. Obsidian from Yellowstone appears in archaeological sites throughout the western United States, but it's worked into tools that show clear regional variations in style and function. Copper from the Great Lakes region has been found as far south as the Gulf of Mexico, but it's incorporated into ornaments and tools that reflect local cultural traditions, rather than standardized designs. These trade networks weren't just about materials. They were systems for sharing innovations, spreading successful adaptations, and maintaining cultural connections across a continent that had been fragmented by catastrophe. The re-establishment of these networks required more than just the desire to trade. It required the development of new social institutions capable of maintaining trust and cooperation between groups that might have had no contact for generations. Archaeologists have found evidence of elaborate ceremonial sites that may have served as neutral meeting grounds where different groups could come together to trade, share information, and maintain social relationships. Poverty Point in Louisiana represents one of the most remarkable examples of these post-catastrophe gathering places. Built around 3,700 years ago, this massive earthwork complex covers nearly 6 square miles and includes concentric ridges, ceremonial mounds, and a central plaza capable of holding thousands of people. The precision of its construction and its astronomical alignments demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of engineering and astronomy, but its true significance may lie in its function as a regional center for trade and cultural exchange. The artifacts found at Poverty Point tell stories of connections spanning the entire continent, stone tools made from materials quarried in the Appalachian Mountains, the Ozark Plateau, and the Rocky Mountains, copper ornaments from the Great Lakes region, marine shells from both the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. This wasn't casual trade between neighbouring communities. It was evidence of organised, long-distance networks that connected regions separated by thousands of miles. The social organisation required to maintain such networks was necessarily complex. Someone had to coordinate the movement of materials across vast distances. Someone had to maintain the knowledge of what resources were available where and when. Someone had to negotiate the agreements that allowed trade to take place between groups with different languages, customs, and social structures. Archaeological evidence suggests that these functions were often fulfilled by specialized groups who devoted themselves to trade and cultural exchange. These weren't merchants in the modern sense, but rather people who combined practical knowledge of geography and resources with social skills needed to navigate between different communities. They were cultural bridges, carrying not just materials, but ideas, technologies, and innovations from one region to another. The role of women in these networks appears to have been particularly significant. Many of the specialized technologies that developed during the post-Younger Dryas period involved traditionally female activities like plant processing, textile production, and food preparation. The innovations in basketry, pottery, and plant domestication that characterized this period often originated with women who had detailed knowledge of local resources and seasonal patterns. Genetic studies of modern Native American populations provide additional evidence for the importance of female networks in post-catastrophe recovery. The patterns of mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited exclusively through the female line, show evidence of long-distance connections between regions that were supposedly isolated from each other. This suggests that women were often the ones who maintained connections between distant communities, perhaps through marriage networks that spanned hundreds or thousands of miles. The development of pottery technology provides a clear example of how innovations spread through these female networks. The earliest pottery in North America appears in the southeastern United States around 4,500 years ago, but within a few centuries, similar techniques had spread throughout much of the continent. The speed of this diffusion suggests organized transmission of knowledge rather than independent invention in multiple locations. The pottery itself tells stories of cultural exchange and adaptation. Early vessels show clear evidence of experimentation with different clay sources, tempering materials, and firing techniques. As the technology matured, distinct regional styles emerged that reflected local preferences and available materials, but the underlying techniques remained remarkably consistent across vast distances. This pattern of initial experimentation, followed by regional adaptation, characterizes many of the innovations that emerged during the post-Younger Dryas period. Agriculture provides another clear example. The domestication of plants began independently in multiple regions of the Americas, but the techniques and knowledge involved spread rapidly through trade networks and cultural exchange. In the eastern woodlands, people began cultivating sunflowers, squash, and various seed plants as early as 4,000 years ago. These weren't accidental discoveries, but deliberate innovations involving careful selection of plant varieties, development of cultivation techniques, and creation of storage systems for surplus crops. The knowledge involved was complex and specialized, requiring understanding of plant biology, soil management, and seasonal cycles that could only be developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation. The domestication of maize in Mexico represents perhaps the most remarkable plant breeding achievement in human history. The transformation of teosinte, a wild grass with tiny seeds, into modern corn required thousands of years of selective breeding and careful cultivation. The people who accomplished this transformation weren't simple farmers stumbling onto useful techniques. They were sophisticated plant breeders with detailed understanding of genetics and heredity that wouldn't be matched by European science until the 19th century. The spread of maize cultivation from Mexico throughout the Americas demonstrates the effectiveness of post-catastrophe trade networks. Within 2,000 years of its initial domestication, maize varieties adapted to different climates and growing conditions had been developed and distributed from Canada to Chile. This wasn't passive diffusion, but active adaptation, involving the development of new varieties suited to specific environmental conditions. The Three Sisters agriculture that developed in much of North America, involving the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash together in the same fields, represents a pinnacle of ecological understanding and agricultural innovation. This system wasn't just efficient in terms of crop yields. It was sustainable in ways that modern agriculture is still struggling to achieve, building soil fertility rather than depleting it, providing balanced nutrition without external inputs, and creating resilience against climate variability and pest problems. The social implications of agricultural development were profound. Reliable food production allowed for larger, more stable populations, which in turn made possible new forms of social organization and cultural development. But the transition to agriculture also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies that required careful management and planning. Communities that had survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe had learned firsthand how quickly environmental conditions could change, and how dangerous it could be to depend too heavily on any single resource. The agricultural systems they developed reflected this hard-won wisdom, emphasizing diversity, flexibility, and resilience rather than maximum efficiency. The rise of Cahokia around 1,000 years ago represents the culmination of these post-catastrophe innovations. At its peak, this urban center near present-day St. Louis supported a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people, making it larger than London at the same time. The agricultural system that fed this population was remarkably sophisticated, involving the cultivation of multiple crops, complex soil management techniques, and trade networks that brought food from hundreds of miles away. The monumental architecture at Cahokia rivaled anything being built anywhere in the world during the medieval period. Monk's Mound, rising 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain, required the movement of over 22 million cubic feet of earth. The precision of its construction and its alignment with astronomical phenomena demonstrate knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and mathematics that challenges assumptions about the capabilities of pre-contact American societies. But perhaps, most remarkably, Cahokia was built without metal tools, without wheels, and without domesticated animals larger than dogs. Every basket of earth that went into Monk's Mound was carried by human labor. Every wooden post in the massive palisade that surrounded the central ceremonial area was cut and shaped with stone tools. The social organization required to coordinate such projects was necessarily complex and sophisticated. The decline of Cahokia around 700 years ago provides a sobering reminder of the fragility of even the most successful civilizations. Climate change, probably involving both drought and flooding, appears to have disrupted the agricultural system that supported the urban population. Political conflicts, possibly related to resource scarcity, may have contributed to social instability. Within a few generations, the great city was largely abandoned, its population dispersed to smaller communities throughout the region. The pattern repeated elsewhere in the Americas during the medieval period. The ancestral Puebloan culture of the Southwest, which had built elaborate cliff dwellings and created complex irrigation systems, went through a period of dramatic reorganization around the same time. Many of their largest settlements were abandoned and populations consolidated into smaller, more defensible locations. These collapses weren't necessarily failures of the civilizations involved. They may have represented adaptive responses to changing conditions, ways of maintaining cultural continuity by accepting short-term disruption to avoid longer-term catastrophe. The oral traditions of modern Pueblo peoples describe these relocations not as defeats, but as planned migrations undertaken to maintain harmony with changing environmental conditions. This pattern of adaptive reorganization in the face of environmental challenges reflects lessons learned from the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Communities that had cultural memories of how quickly stable conditions could disappear were more likely to develop flexible responses to new challenges. They were willing to abandon successful strategies when conditions changed rather than trying to maintain them regardless of circumstances. The European arrival in the Americas beginning 500 years ago created new challenges that tested these adaptive capabilities. Diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity devastated populations throughout the continent. New technologies, new economic systems, and new forms of social organization disrupted traditional ways of life. Political conquest and cultural suppression attempted to eliminate indigenous knowledge systems that had been developed over thousands of years. Yet many of the innovations that had emerged from the post-Younger Dryas recovery proved remarkably resilient. Agricultural techniques developed by Native Americans became the foundation for global food systems that now feed billions of people. Maize, potatoes, beans, squash, tomatoes, and dozens of other crops domesticated in the Americas transformed diets and economies worldwide. The social institutions and knowledge systems that had preserved essential information through the dark centuries after the catastrophe continued to function, even under the pressures of colonization and cultural suppression. Modern archaeological research is revealing the full scope of these achievements and their connections to the ancient catastrophe that reshaped the continent. Advanced analytical techniques are uncovering evidence of sophisticated technologies, complex social organizations, and sustainable practices that developed in response to the environmental challenges created by the Younger Dryas impact. Ground-penetrating radar is revealing the extent of earthwork complexes that were previously unknown or underappreciated. Sites like Serpent Mound in Ohio, with its quarter-mile-long effigy of a snake, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of astronomy and landscape architecture. Similar sites throughout the Americas are being recognized as components of larger systems of monuments, trade networks, and cultural landscapes that span the continent. Genetic studies of crop plants are revealing the sophistication of Native American plant breeding programs. The diversity of maize varieties that existed before European contact was extraordinary, with hundreds of distinct types adapted to different climates, soils, and growing conditions. This genetic diversity represented thousands of years of careful selection and breeding, creating resources that modern agriculture is only beginning to appreciate. Studies of soil chemistry at archaeological sites are revealing the sustainability of indigenous agricultural practices. Fields that were farmed continuously for hundreds or thousands of years show evidence of maintained or even improved soil fertility, achieved through techniques like crop rotation, composting, and the careful management of fire. These practices offer lessons for modern agriculture struggling with problems of soil depletion and environmental degradation. The oral traditions that preserve knowledge of the Younger Dryas catastrophe continue to yield insights into both past events and indigenous knowledge systems. Stories that seemed purely mythological to earlier generations of researchers are being recognized as sophisticated encoding of practical information about astronomy, ecology, and history. The precision with which these traditions have maintained information across hundreds of generations challenges assumptions about the reliability of oral transmission and the capabilities of non-literate societies. Recent collaborations between indigenous knowledge keepers and academic researchers are revealing the depth and sophistication of traditional ecological knowledge. Native American communities maintain detailed understanding of plant and animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and environmental relationships that complement and often exceed scientific knowledge. This understanding isn't just practical, but theoretical, involving sophisticated models of how natural systems function and how human activities can be managed to maintain ecological balance. The preservation of this knowledge through the disruptions of the past 5 centuries demonstrates the resilience of the cultural institutions that emerged from the post-Younger Dryas recovery. Despite tremendous pressures to assimilate into Euro-American society, many indigenous communities have maintained traditional practices, languages, and knowledge systems. These aren't museum pieces or curiosities, but living, evolving traditions that continue to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining essential elements of identity and understanding. The revitalization of indigenous languages, currently underway in many communities throughout the Americas, represents more than cultural preservation. Languages encode ways of understanding the world that can be lost when the language disappears. The complex ecological knowledge embedded in indigenous languages often cannot be directly translated into European languages because it involves concepts and categories that don't exist in those linguistic systems. The Three Sisters agricultural system, for example, cannot be fully understood without the indigenous knowledge systems that developed it. The relationships between the three crops involve not just practical considerations like soil fertility and pest control, but also spiritual and social dimensions that are encoded in traditional ceremonies, stories, and seasonal observances. The system works as agriculture, but it also functions as a way of maintaining cultural identity and community cohesion. Modern climate change research is revealing new relevance for the lessons learned from the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The rapid environmental changes occurring today echo in some ways the challenges faced by post-catastrophe communities 12,000 years ago. The need for adaptive management, flexible institutions, and resilient technologies has never been more apparent. Indigenous communities, with their long experience of environmental variability and their cultural memories of catastrophic change, are increasingly recognized as important sources of knowledge about adaptation and resilience. Traditional practices like controlled burning, sustainable harvesting, and community-based resource management are being studied and adopted by mainstream environmental management agencies. The earthwork complexes built by post-catastrophe communities are being recognized as sophisticated examples of landscape architecture that integrated human settlements with natural systems. Sites like Cahokia weren't just urban centers, but components of larger systems that managed water flow, maintained soil fertility, and created habitat for wildlife. These integrated approaches to land use offer models for sustainable development that are increasingly relevant as modern societies struggle with the environmental consequences of industrial development. The trade networks that connected post-catastrophe communities across vast distances demonstrate possibilities for cooperation and cultural exchange that transcend political boundaries. These networks maintained peace and facilitated the sharing of innovations across regions with different languages, customs, and social organizations. The institutions that made such cooperation possible offer lessons for modern efforts to address global challenges that require coordination across national and cultural boundaries. The artistic traditions that flourished in post-catastrophe America demonstrate the importance of cultural expression in maintaining community identity and social cohesion. The elaborate pottery, sophisticated textiles, and monumental architecture produced by these societies weren't luxuries or status symbols, but essential elements of social systems that needed to maintain continuity across generations and adapt to changing conditions. Modern neuroscience is beginning to understand how artistic and ceremonial activities function to encode and transmit cultural information. The rhythms, patterns, and symbols used in traditional arts aren't just aesthetic choices, but information storage and transmission systems that can maintain complex knowledge across generations without writing. The sophistication of these systems challenges assumptions about the capabilities of oral cultures and offers insights into alternative ways of organizing and preserving knowledge. The astronomical knowledge embedded in sites like Cahokia and Poverty Point demonstrates the importance of accurate timekeeping and seasonal prediction for agricultural societies. The ability to predict seasonal changes, celestial events, and long-term climate cycles was essential for communities that depended on precise timing for planting, harvesting, and other critical activities. The monuments that encoded this knowledge weren't just ceremonial centers, but practical tools for maintaining the temporal precision that agricultural societies required. The decline and abandonment of some of these sites around 700 years ago provides lessons about the limits of sustainability and the importance of adaptive management. Even the most sophisticated societies can face challenges that exceed their adaptive capabilities. The key to long-term survival isn't avoiding all challenges, but developing the flexibility to recognize when fundamental changes are necessary and the institutional capacity to implement those changes before crisis becomes catastrophe. The European arrival in the Americas created challenges of unprecedented scale and character. The diseases, technologies, and social systems introduced by Europeans were unlike anything that indigenous societies had previously encountered. The speed and scope of change exceeded even the Younger Dryas catastrophe, in some respects, creating disruptions that traditional adaptive mechanisms couldn't fully address. Yet many indigenous communities survived and adapted even to these unprecedented challenges. The institutions, knowledge systems, and cultural practices that had been developed over thousands of years of responding to environmental variability provided foundations for responses to colonial pressures. Communities that maintained strong cultural identities and traditional knowledge systems were often more successful at adapting to changed conditions than those that attempted to completely assimilate into European-derived societies. The current revival of interest in indigenous knowledge and traditional practices represents recognition of their continued relevance and value. Modern environmental challenges, from climate change to biodiversity loss, require the kinds of long-term thinking and adaptive management that indigenous communities have been practicing for thousands of years. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern science is producing new approaches to environmental management that are more effective and sustainable than either system alone. The study of the Younger Dryas impact and its consequences continues to reveal new insights into the relationships between environmental change, technological innovation, and social adaptation. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how human societies respond to catastrophic challenges and how they can build resilience against future disruptions. Advanced analytical techniques are revealing previously unknown details about the scope and character of the ancient catastrophe. Isotope analysis of sediment cores is providing precise information about the timing and magnitude of environmental changes. Genetic studies of both human and animal populations are revealing the demographic consequences of the impact and the subsequent recovery. Archaeological investigations are uncovering evidence of the cultural innovations that emerged in response to changed conditions. This research is also revealing the global context of the Younger Dryas event. Similar evidence of cosmic impacts and environmental disruption has been found on every continent, suggesting that the catastrophe that reshaped North America was part of a worldwide phenomenon. The recovery processes that occurred in the Americas paralleled developments elsewhere, but each region developed unique adaptations suited to local conditions and challenges. The precision of modern dating techniques is allowing researchers to trace the spread of innovations with unprecedented accuracy. The development and diffusion of pottery technology, the domestication and spread of crop plants, and the construction of monumental architecture can now be tracked with decade-level precision across thousands of miles and hundreds of years. This precision is revealing the speed and sophistication of post-catastrophe cultural development. Computer modeling of climate systems is providing new insights into the mechanisms that triggered the Younger Dryas climate changes. The cosmic impacts appear to have disrupted atmospheric circulation patterns, ocean currents, and ice sheet dynamics in ways that created cascading effects throughout Earth's environmental systems. Understanding these mechanisms is important for assessing the risks that similar events might pose to modern civilization. The integration of multiple lines of evidence is creating increasingly detailed pictures of what life was like during the catastrophe and recovery periods. Paleoecological studies are revealing how plant and animal communities changed in response to environmental disruption. Archaeological investigations are showing how human communities adapted their technologies, settlement patterns, and social organizations. Genetic studies are tracing the demographic consequences of population bottlenecks and recovery. This multidisciplinary approach is also revealing the complexity of human-environment interactions during periods of rapid change. The extinctions of megafauna weren't simply the result of climate change or human hunting, but involved complex interactions between environmental stress, demographic changes, and human behavior. The development of agriculture wasn't just a response to population pressure or environmental change, but involved conscious decisions about risk management and resource security. The story that emerges from this research is one of remarkable human resilience and adaptability. The people who survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe didn't just endure the immediate crisis, but used it as an opportunity to develop new technologies, new social institutions, and new ways of understanding their relationship with the environment. The innovations that emerged from this period laid the foundation for all subsequent cultural development in the Americas. The oral traditions that preserved memory of the catastrophe across more than 400 generations demonstrate the power of cultural institutions to maintain essential information across vast periods of time. These traditions weren't just stories or entertainment, but sophisticated information storage systems that encoded practical knowledge about environmental risks, adaptive strategies, and cultural values. Their preservation represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in knowledge management. The diversity of cultures that developed in the post-catastrophe Americas demonstrates the creative potential that can emerge from disruption and challenge. Instead of simply recreating what had existed before, survivors developed new approaches that were better adapted to changed conditions and more resilient against future disruptions. This innovation wasn't random, but reflected conscious choices about how to build sustainable relationships with challenging environments. The sustainable practices developed by post-catastrophe communities offer lessons that are increasingly relevant for modern societies facing their own environmental challenges. The agricultural techniques, resource management systems, and social institutions that emerged from the Younger Dryas recovery were tested by thousands of years of environmental variability and cultural change. Their continued effectiveness demonstrates principles of sustainability that modern societies are only beginning to understand. The collapse of some of these societies in response to medieval climate changes provides warnings about the limits of adaptation and the importance of maintaining flexibility in the face of changing conditions. Even the most sophisticated and successful societies can face challenges that exceed their adaptive capabilities. The key to long-term survival isn't perfection, but the ability to recognize when fundamental changes are necessary and the institutional capacity to implement those changes. The survival of indigenous knowledge systems through the disruptions of the past 5 centuries demonstrates the resilience of institutions that are designed to preserve essential information across generations. Despite tremendous pressures to assimilate or disappear, many communities have maintained traditional practices, languages, and ways of understanding that trace their origins back to the post-catastrophe recovery period. These living traditions represent direct connections to one of humanity's greatest survival stories. Modern efforts to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and other global environmental challenges are increasingly drawing on the lessons learned from the Younger Dryas recovery. The need for adaptive management, resilient institutions, and sustainable practices has never been more apparent. The innovations developed by post-catastrophe communities offer tested approaches to these challenges that complement and enhance modern technological solutions. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern science is producing new insights into both past events and future possibilities. Indigenous knowledge keepers, working with academic researchers, are revealing details about the Younger Dryas catastrophe and its consequences that wouldn't be apparent from either approach alone. This collaboration is also developing new approaches to environmental management that combine the long-term perspective of traditional knowledge with the analytical power of modern science. The study of the ancient cataclysm that changed America forever continues to yield new insights into the relationships between environmental change, human adaptation, and cultural innovation. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how societies respond to catastrophic challenges and how they can build resilience against future disruptions. The story is far from complete, but the outlines are clear enough to recognize its profound significance for understanding both human history and future possibilities. The people who lived through the Younger Dryas catastrophe and built new civilizations from its aftermath weren't fundamentally different from us. They faced challenges that seemed insurmountable with technologies that seemed primitive by modern standards. Yet they not only survived, but created some of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Their example offers both warnings about the fragility of civilization and hope about humanity's capacity for adaptation and renewal. As we face our own environmental challenges and contemplate the future of human civilization, the lessons learned from the ancient catastrophe become increasingly relevant. The need for resilient institutions, sustainable practices, and adaptive management has never been more apparent. The innovations developed by our ancestors in response to their greatest challenge offer tested approaches to building societies that can survive and thrive in an uncertain world. The story of the ancient cataclysm that changed America forever is ultimately a story about human potential. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, even when the world itself seems to be ending, human creativity, determination, and wisdom can find ways not just to survive, but to build something better from the ruins of what came before. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of all. That catastrophe, while terrifying and destructive, can also be transformative, opening possibilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world seems still and we can almost hear the whispers of the past, it's worth remembering those ancient survivors who looked up at falling stars and chose not to despair, but to adapt, to innovate, to preserve what mattered most, and to build something new. Their legacy lives on in every ear of corn, every carefully tended garden, every story told around a fire. They remind us that we are the descendants of survivors, inheritors of wisdom earned through the hardest of experiences, carriers of traditions that have been tested by time and catastrophe, and perhaps most importantly, that we carry within us the capacity to face whatever challenges the future may hold. The story doesn't end with the recovery from the Younger Dryas. In many ways, it continues today as scientists work to piece together the full picture of what happened during those pivotal centuries. New technologies are revealing details that would have been impossible to detect even a decade ago. Laser scanning is mapping earthwork complexes that were previously unknown. DNA analysis is tracing the movements and relationships of ancient populations with unprecedented precision. Isotope studies are revealing details about diet, climate, and environmental change at the seasonal level. Perhaps most remarkably, the collaboration between indigenous knowledge keepers and academic researchers is opening new windows into the deep past. Oral traditions that were dismissed by earlier generations of scholars are being recognized as sophisticated repositories of historical and ecological knowledge. Stories that seemed purely mythological are revealing themselves to contain precise information about astronomical events, climate changes, and cultural adaptations. The Menominee tradition of the great serpent that swallowed the sun, causing the world to become cold and dark, may be a memory of the cosmic bombardment and its atmospheric effects. The Cherokee stories of the world catching fire, followed by a long winter, match remarkably well with what the geological record shows happened during the Younger Dryas transition. The Hopi prophecies about the purification of the world by fire and ice echo themes found in oral traditions across the Americas. These aren't just stories. They're historical documents, preserved with extraordinary fidelity across more than 400 generations of oral transmission. The fact that they have survived with such consistency suggests that the events they describe were so significant, so transformative, that they became embedded in the very foundation of human consciousness in the Americas. Modern genetic studies are revealing additional layers to this story. Analysis of DNA from ancient human remains is showing that the populations who survived the Younger Dryas bottleneck were remarkably diverse, representing multiple migration waves and cultural traditions. The Americas weren't populated by a single group of people, but by multiple populations who arrived at different times and followed different routes. Some may have come across the Bering Land Bridge during periods when sea levels were low. Others might have followed coastal routes, using watercraft to island hop along the Pacific Rim. Still others could have crossed the Atlantic, following ice edges or using early maritime technologies. The genetic evidence suggests that all of these routes were used at different times, creating a complex mosaic of human populations across the Americas. The Younger Dryas catastrophe affected all of these populations, but in different ways, depending on where they lived and how they had adapted to their local environments. Arctic populations, already adapted to cold conditions, may have fared better than groups living in temperate regions. Coastal peoples might have been better positioned to survive than those dependent on inland megafauna. Mountain communities could have found refuge in protected valleys, while plains dwellers faced the full force of climate change. These different survival experiences help explain the remarkable diversity of Native American cultures that existed at the time of European contact. Each group had adapted to specific environmental challenges and had developed unique solutions to the problems of survival in their particular region. The sophistication of these adaptations becomes apparent when we examine how well they worked over thousands of years of environmental variability. The agricultural systems developed in the eastern woodlands, for example, weren't just efficient in terms of crop yields. They were designed to maintain soil fertility over centuries of continuous cultivation. The Three Sisters system of growing corn, beans, and squash together created nitrogen-fixing relationships that actually improved soil quality over time. The controlled burning practices used to manage forest ecosystems maintained biodiversity while reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfires. Similar sophistication is evident in the irrigation systems of the Southwest. The Hohokam people of the Sonoran Desert created canal networks that channeled seasonal floods across hundreds of square miles of arid land. These systems weren't just engineering marvels. They were integrated with social institutions that managed water rights, maintained the canals, and distributed the risks and benefits of cooperative agriculture across entire communities. The mound-building cultures of the Mississippi Valley created earthwork complexes that served multiple functions simultaneously. They were ceremonial centers, astronomical observatories, flood control systems, and markers of territorial boundaries. The largest of these complexes, like Cahokia, required the coordination of thousands of workers and the maintenance of complex social hierarchies, yet they also incorporated principles of sustainability and environmental management that allowed them to function for centuries. The artistic traditions that flourished in post-catastrophe America weren't just expressions of creativity, but sophisticated information storage systems. The geometric patterns found on pottery, textiles, and architectural elements often encoded practical information about astronomical cycles, seasonal patterns, and resource locations. The stories, songs, and ceremonies that accompanied these artistic traditions served to transmit this encoded information from generation to generation. Modern research is revealing the depth and precision of this encoded knowledge. Petroglyphs in the southwest contain accurate star maps showing celestial configurations from thousands of years ago. Pottery designs from the eastern woodlands incorporate mathematical relationships that weren't formally recognized by European mathematics until centuries later. Textile patterns from Peru contain information about Quipu recording systems that functioned as sophisticated data storage networks. These weren't primitive attempts at record keeping. They were elegant solutions to the problem of maintaining complex information in societies without writing systems. The knowledge they preserved wasn't just cultural, but practical, including detailed understanding of ecology, astronomy, medicine, and technology that was essential for survival and success in challenging environments. The decline of some of these sophisticated societies in the centuries before European contact provides important lessons about the limits of sustainability and the importance of adaptive management. Even the most successful cultural adaptations can face challenges that exceed their capacity to respond. Climate change, resource depletion, population growth, and social conflict can create cascading effects that overwhelm even the most resilient systems. The abandonment of Mesa Verde and other ancestral pueblo sites around 700 years ago appears to have resulted from a combination of drought, resource depletion, and social conflict. The sophisticated cliff dwellings and irrigation systems that had supported thousands of people for centuries couldn't cope with the combination of environmental stress and internal tensions that developed during the medieval warm period. Similar patterns affected other regions. The decline of Cahokia coincided with climate changes that disrupted the agricultural systems supporting its large population. The collapse of some Mississippian chiefdoms appears to have resulted from political instability exacerbated by environmental challenges. In each case, societies that had been remarkably successful for centuries faced combinations of challenges that exceeded their adaptive capacity. Tonight, as we reach the end of this journey through deep time, we're left with something profound to consider. The story of the Younger Dryas impact isn't just ancient history buried in sediment layers and ice cores. It's a reminder that the world we inhabit, the civilizations we've built, the very ground beneath our feet, all of it rests on foundations far more fragile than we often care to admit. The evidence continues to accumulate, piece by careful piece. Each new crater discovered, each platinum anomaly detected, each microscopic diamond pulled from the black mat layer adds another brushstroke to a picture that's still being painted. Science moves slowly, methodically, testing and retesting, but the outline is becoming unmistakable. Something extraordinary happened to this continent 12,800 years ago, something that changed everything. Perhaps what's most remarkable isn't just the scale of the catastrophe, but the resilience of life itself. The Clovis people, the megafauna, the vast ecosystems that dominated the late Pleistocene, they all faced extinction. Many didn't make it, but some did. Scattered survivors in caves and refugees, holding on to knowledge, maintaining hope, adapting to a world that had become utterly alien overnight. Their descendants built something new from the ruins. The great civilizations of the Americas, from the mound builders of the Mississippi to the agricultural innovators of Mexico, from the astronomical observers of the Southwest to the maritime cultures of the coasts, all of them trace their roots back to those dark centuries, when a handful of human beings refused to surrender to an ending world. The oral traditions that preserved memory of the great catastrophe across 400 generations represent something unprecedented in human history. These weren't just stories told around fires. They were insurance policies, cultural DNA designed to remember what must never be forgotten. That the world can change suddenly. That survival requires adaptation. That knowledge once lost may never be recovered. As modern science pieces together this ancient puzzle, we're not just learning about the past. We're discovering truths about our own fragility and resilience that seem more relevant with each passing year. The same forces that reshaped North America 12,800 years ago are still out there, still moving through the cosmic dark, still capable of transforming everything we think we know about tomorrow. But we're also learning about the remarkable capacity of life to endure, adapt, and ultimately flourish, even in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The story of the Younger Dryas isn't just about destruction. It's about renewal. It's about the quiet courage of survivors who looked at a broken world and decided to build something better. So as you drift off tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you the image of those ancient Americans, watching stars fall from the sky, feeling the ground shake beneath their feet, yet somehow finding the strength to continue. They are our ancestors in the deepest sense, not just in blood, but in spirit. They remind us that we too are survivors, inheritors of wisdom earned in the hardest of schools, carriers of stories that connect us to the very foundations of this continent we call home. The ancient cataclysm that changed America forever may have ended one world, but it also began another. And that beginning, that refusal to surrender to the darkness, continues in each of us today.